couple of weeks back, I got to ride White's brand new S150 Trail / Enduro bike. Do some grippier tires. As the name suggests, it's a 150mm travel 29er that can also fit 650B plus wheels with up to 2.8-inch tires. It's a pretty versatile bike designed for everything from kind of trail center blasts all the way up to enduro racing. Whites have always been pretty forward thinking with their geometry, and the S150 is no different. The reach on the medium is 460mm, and on the XL that I rode it's 490mm, so it's pretty roomy in the reach. The bottom bracket is also super low at 335mm. That's teamed with a pretty short 170mm crank to avoid those pedals hitting the ground, and the head angle is kicked out nice and slack at 65.5 degrees. Something that's really interesting about the geometry of this bike is the use of a custom fork offset. So the fork offset is basically the distance by which the front axle sits in front of the steering axis, and normally that measurement is 51mm on a 29er. But White have stocked a 42mm fork offset that you'd normally find on a 650B fork. What this does is it kind of cams the steering by increasing something that's known as the trail figure, which is basically how far the contact patch sits behind the steering axis, the line through the center of your steerer tube. So the larger that trail distance, the more the contact patch wants to just follow the steering axis. When you're going through rough terrain or through really fast corners, the front wheel wants to kind of track in more of a straight line. So it makes the steering much calmer, a little bit like making the head angle slacker, but without making the front sensor even longer. So it's kind of easier to weight the front wheel, like you had a steeper head angle, but also makes the steering calmer as if you had a slacker head angle. On the trail, what I found almost immediately was that the bike turned in quite a sort of predictable way. I think this is partly to do with that steering geometry, but I think it's also to do with the stiff frame and stiff wheels, which kind of seem to make it easier to judge exactly what the tires are doing underneath you and to kind of play with the limits of traction. It's hard to say to what extent the fork offset plays a role in this, but overall I really liked how the bike kind of carves through a corner. As well as the geometry, White have worked quite hard with the suspension tune. It's now a pretty progressive linkage all the way through the stroke. Part of the reason for that is that White wanted it to be compatible with a coil shock, but also I think a progressive linkage works a lot better with an air shock too, partly because you don't have to ram it full of volume spacers, which can make the rebound unpredictable, but also because it means you have to rely less on compression damping to give you support, and that means that the off-the-top sensitivity is improved. And you really notice this on the White, that the small bump sensitivity as you kind of go over high-speed chattery trails feels really good. The bike feels quite composed and never overly harsh, but at the same time I also felt like I had enough support both in the corners and when pumping the trail and hopping over obstacles. There's a balance to be struck between sensitivity and pedal efficiency, and I think White have done quite a good job here as well. There is a bit of pedal bob, but really not too much. You can kind of bang on the pedals without worrying about it too much, and if it really bothers you, you can always flick the climb switch on the shock. The seat angle is also relatively steep at about 75 degrees, that's the effective seat angle. So when you're winching up steep climbs, it feels pretty good. It climbs really well. So despite having quite a lot of travel on tap, it doesn't feel kind of overbiked, which is not a term I really use very often, but it really doesn't feel lazy or slow on the climbs, even on a kind of relatively mellow trail center spin. While I really liked the super wide 800mm bar, at 6'3" I found it was a little bit too low for me, which actually works really well on kind of flat trail center corners, but if I wanted to move away from that onto steeper terrain, I definitely want to fit a higher rise bar and possibly a shorter stem as well, going from the 50mm stem that comes on the XL down to something like a 40mm. That would help me get my weight back if I needed to on steeper terrain, and also weight the front wheel when pushing down into downslopes and what have you. I tested the top of the range Works model, which comes with White's own carbon wheels with a 29mm internal width. They're shod with Maxxis tyres. It's got a High Roller 2 up front and a Minion semi-slick on the rear. I actually quite like those tyres. I would have thought that a High Roller 2 would come up too square on that wide rim, but I actually found it quite predictable in the bends, so it's not too much of a problem. I rode the bike with 29-inch wheels, and that's how White will sell the bike, but they will offer a 27 plus wheel set as an aftermarket option. I've always been a big fan of 29ers, and it's really cool to see how they've evolved, with companies like White pushing the boundaries of head angles and geometry, and also starting to experiment with fork offset as well. I think that's really exciting. I think that what White have done with this bike, especially alongside others like Scott with the new Genius, really points the direction that 29ers should be going in, and I'm really excited to see where that ends up.